Courtroom erupts. Black grandma lawyer outs racist judge's dark past. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Washington stood tall, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes fixed on Judge Richard Harrington. At 72, Eleanor's voice still commanded respect, and today it carried something else, a righteous fury that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Your Honor," she said, her tone cutting through the tension. "Before you pass sentence on my client, I believe this court deserves to know exactly who sits in judgment today." Judge Harrington's face flushed. "Counselor, you are out of order." His gavel slammed down, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "Am I?" Eleanor pulled a weathered photograph from her briefcase. "Because I believe the court should see this before proceeding." She held up the image for all to see, a younger Richard Harrington in a white hood, his face partially visible, standing among other robed figures before a burning cross. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge's face drained of color. "This photograph was taken on June 12, 1967, Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The same night Marcus Turner was found beaten within an inch of his life on County Road 17. The same Marcus Turner who happens to be my client's father." The judge rose from his seat, rage distorting his features. "I will have you disbarred for this. This is what, Your Honor, the truth?" Eleanor's voice rose. "For 40 years I've waited for justice, and today, standing before the very man who helped destroy my family, I finally have the chance to bailiff, remove Ms. Washington from my courtroom immediately." Judge Harrington shouted, his composure completely shattered. As the bailiff approached, Eleanor stood her ground. "The world deserves to know who Richard Harrington really is. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor Washington walked into the courthouse for what she thought would be her last case before retirement. Eleanor pulled her old Buick into the courthouse parking lot, the same spot she'd been using for over 40 years of practicing law. The arthritis in her knuckles flared as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. Today wasn't just another day in court, it was supposed to be her last. At 72, she had planned to retire after this final case, a simple assault charge for Darius Turner, the grandson of her oldest friend. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered to herself, gathering her weathered leather briefcase from the passenger seat. Inside was 40 years of legal knowledge and one photograph she'd held onto since 1967, never quite knowing when the right time would come to use it. The courthouse hadn't changed much since Eleanor first walked through its doors as one of the first black female attorneys in the county. The same marble columns, the same wooden benches, the same prejudices hiding behind polite smiles and legal jargon. Inside, her client Darius waited, dressed in his best suit, the one his grandmother had insisted he wear. At 25, he had her friend Marcus's eyes and the same stubborn set to his jaw. "Ms. Washington," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you for doing this. I know you're supposed to be retiring." Eleanor smiled. "Your grandfather would never forgive me if I let anyone else handle this. Besides, it's a simple case. You were defending yourself, plain and simple." Darius nodded, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "My public defender said I should just plead guilty, said with my record no one would believe it was self-defense." "Your record of 2 misdemeanors from when you were barely 18? Eleanor shook her head. "That's why I'm here. Some things haven't changed as much as people like to pretend." As they talked through the details one last time, the court clerk approached. "Ms. Washington, there's been a change. Judge Peters is out sick. Judge Harrington will be presiding today." Eleanor froze. "Richard Harrington?" "Yes, ma'am. Court begins in 20 minutes. After the clerk walked away, Darius noticed Eleanor's expression. "What is it? Is that bad?" Eleanor's mind raced back through decades. Richard Harrington. A name she'd followed from a distance for years as he rose through the ranks from prosecutor to judge. A name connected to one of the darkest nights in her memory. "Ms. Washington?" Darius's voice pulled her back to the present. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Judge Harrington has a reputation for harsh sentences, particularly with young black men." What she didn't say was that 40 years ago, she had recognized Richard Harrington's eyes beneath a white hood on a night when her best friend's husband had been left for dead. She'd kept the photograph she'd managed to take hidden all these years, never having enough proof to bring forward accusations against the son of one of the most powerful families in the county. "Great," Darius sighed. "So I'm going to jail no matter what." "Not if I can help it," Eleanor said firmly, patting her briefcase. Some truths had waited long enough. In the courtroom, Eleanor settled at the defense table, her back straight despite the years weighing on her. She watched as Richard Harrington entered, his silver hair perfectly combed, his robes pristine. At 68, he had the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. Their eyes met briefly, and Alina saw a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or wariness. Did he remember her? Or was she just another face, another black woman he'd never bothered to truly see? The proceedings began routinely enough. The charges were read: assault in the second degree. The prosecution painted Darius as a troublemaker with a history of violence, exaggerating his minor past offenses. Alina observed Judge Harrington nodding slightly at the prosecutor's words, his mind seemingly made up before the defense had even spoken. When it was Alina's turn, she approached the bench with the steady determination that had carried her through decades of fighting an uphill battle in this very courthouse. "Your Honor, my client was defending himself against Thomas Wheeler, who had threatened him repeatedly and used racial slurs before initiating physical contact. Mr. Turner's actions were reasonable and proportionate to the threat he faced." Judge Harrington's expression remained impassive. "Ms. Washington, your client has a history of violent behavior. 2 misdemeanors from 7 years ago hardly constitute a pattern, Your Honor," Alina countered. "And the witness statements I've submitted clearly show that Mr. Wheeler was the aggressor." As she spoke, Alina noticed something she hadn't before, a small scar along the judge's jawline, partially hidden by his collar. A scar that brought back a flood of memories from 1967, when Marcus Turner had fought back against his attackers, managing to strike one before being overwhelmed. Judge Harrington cut her off. "I've reviewed the statements, Counselor. They come from Mr. Turner's friends, hardly impartial witnesses. And the prosecution's witnesses are Mr. Wheeler's drinking buddies," Alina replied. "The difference is, my client's witnesses have no criminal records, unlike Mr. Wheeler's associates." The judge's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, Ms. Washington. I won't have you impugning the character of witnesses in my courtroom." Alina felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger she'd carried since watching Marcus Turner lie in a hospital bed, broken and bloodied, while the police claimed there wasn't enough evidence to pursue his attackers. "My apologies, Your Honor," she said, her voice level despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'm simply attempting to ensure my client receives a fair hearing." The trial proceeded with Alina meticulously presenting evidence of Thomas Wheeler's history of racially motivated confrontations. Through it all, Judge Harrington seemed increasingly agitated, particularly when Alina emphasized the racial component of the incident. During a brief recess, Darius leaned over to her. "He hates me. I can see it in his eyes." Alina patted his hand. "It's not about you, Darius. Some hatreds run deeper than the individual." When court resumed, Wheeler took the stand, painting himself as an innocent victim while casting sidelong glances at the judge that suggested a shared understanding. Alina watched Judge Harrington's subtle nods and leading questions that guided Wheeler toward more sympathetic testimony. During cross-examination, Alina was direct. "Mr. Wheeler, did you or did you not call my client a?" She paused. "I believe your exact words were uppity N-word who needed to be taught his place." Wheeler shifted uncomfortably. "I don't recall my exact words. It was a heated moment." "Several witnesses recall your exact words quite clearly," Alina pressed, "just as they recall you throwing the first punch." "Objection," the prosecutor called out. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Judge Harrington said immediately. "Ms. Washington, stick to questions, not accusations." Alina nodded, but as she turned back to Wheeler, she saw the judge give him a nearly imperceptible nod of encouragement. In that moment, something clicked into place. The connection between Wheeler and Harrington wasn't coincidental. They knew each other. After Wheeler stepped down, Alina requested permission to approach the bench. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I believe you may have a conflict of interest in this case." Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." Thomas Wheeler's uncle was Stanley Wheeler, wasn't he? A prominent member of the local Citizens Council in the 1960s. The judge's face hardened. "Ms. Washington, what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm simply concerned about potential connections that might affect your impartiality in this case." "That will be enough," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "One more word about this, and I'll hold you in contempt. Return to your table." As Alina walked back, she knew what she had to do. The photograph in her briefcase had waited long enough. This wasn't just about Darius anymore. It was about Marcus, about justice decades delayed. When Darius took the stand, he told his story with clarity and conviction. He explained how Wheeler had harassed him repeatedly, how the confrontation had escalated, and how he'd only fought back when Wheeler and his friends had surrounded him. "I was scared," Darius admitted. "I didn't want to fight, but I wasn't going to let them hurt me either." Judge Harrington's questioning was pointed, designed to trip Darius up, to make him appear aggressive rather than defensive. Alina objected several times to the judge's leading questions, only to be overruled. As the testimony concluded, Alina could see the writing on the wall. Judge Harrington had made his decision before they'd even begun. Unless she acted now, Darius would become another victim of a system that had been failing people who looked like him for generations. During closing arguments, the prosecutor painted Darius as a troublemaker who'd escalated a minor disagreement into violence. When it was Alina's turn, she stood slowly, feeling the weight of 40 years of silence. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that my client acted in self-defense against Mr. Wheeler's unprovoked aggression." The witness testimony supports this conclusion, as does Mr. Wheeler's history of similar confrontations. Judge Harrington's expression remained stone-faced as Alina continued her argument, methodically dismantling the prosecution's case. But as she neared the end of her statement, she deviated from her planned remarks. "This case is about more than a single incident. It's about patterns of behavior and judgment that persist across generations. It's about who we choose to believe and who we choose to condemn based not on evidence but on prejudice." The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Washington, stick to the facts of the case." "The facts, Your Honor, extend beyond this single incident," Alina continued. "They reach back decades to patterns of injustice that continue to this day." As Judge Harrington prepared to interrupt her again, Alina made her decision. She opened her briefcase and removed the photograph she'd kept hidden for 40 years. "Before you rule, Your Honor, I believe this courtroom should know exactly who sits in judgment today." The courtroom fell silent as Alina stood tall, her eyes fixed on Judge Richard Harrington. At 72, Alina's voice still commanded respect, and today it carried something else, a righteous fury that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Your Honor," she said, her tone cutting through the tension. "Before you pass sentence on my client, I believe this court deserves to know exactly who sits in judgment today." Judge Harrington's face flushed. "Counselor, you are out of order." His gavel slammed down, but Alina didn't flinch. "Am I?" Alina pulled the weathered photograph from her briefcase. "Because I believe the court should see this before proceeding." She held up the image for all to see, a younger Richard Harrington in a white hood, his face partially visible, standing among other robed figures before a burning cross. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge's face drained of color. "This photograph was taken on June 12, 1967, Alina continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The same night Marcus Turner was found beaten within an inch of his life on County Road 17. The same Marcus Turner who happens to be my client's father." The judge rose from his seat, rage distorting his features. "I will have you disbarred for this. This is what, Your Honor, the truth?" Alina's voice rose. "For 40 years I've waited for justice, and today, standing before the very man who helped destroy my family, I finally have the chance to bailiff, remove Ms. Washington from my courtroom immediately." Judge Harrington shouted, his composure completely shattered. As the bailiff approached, Alina stood her ground. "The world deserves to know who Richard Harrington really is." Judge Harrington shouted, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. "That photograph proves nothing. It could be anyone." Alina looked him directly in the eyes. "You have a scar along your jawline, Your Honor. Marcus Turner gave you that scar when he fought back that night. He told me he'd struck one of his attackers with his signet ring, the one his father gave him when he graduated college. The only black man in his class at Southern State in 1958. The judge's hand unconsciously moved to his jaw, confirming what everyone could now see was true. Alina continued, her voice growing stronger. "I was there that night, hiding in the woods, terrified but unwilling to leave my friend's husband alone. I took this picture, and I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment to bring it forward. I recognized your voice when you laughed as Marcus begged for his life." District Attorney William Collins, who had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm, stood up. "Your Honor, in light of these allegations, I believe it would be appropriate to request a recess and perhaps reassignment of this case to another judge." Judge Harrington glared at the DA. "You believe this nonsense, Collins? This is a desperate ploy by a defense attorney trying to save her guilty client." But the damage was done. The reporters were already filing out of the courtroom, racing to file their stories. The photograph had been seen by too many people. "The Wheeler family protected you back then," Alina said, quieter now. "Stanley Wheeler was the sheriff who buried the investigation, and now you're protecting his nephew. Some patterns never change, do they, Your Honor?" Darius sat stunned at the defense table, suddenly understanding why Alina had taken his case so personally. This wasn't just about him, it was about his father, about a history he'd only heard pieces of growing up. Judge Harrington, seeing his carefully constructed life crumbling around him, made one last attempt to regain control. This court is in recess until tomorrow morning. Bailiff, confiscate that photograph as evidence of contempt. But Alina was prepared. The original is safe, Your Honor, and copies have already been sent to every major news outlet in the state, along with my sworn affidavit about the events of that night. The courtroom doors burst open as more reporters pushed their way in, alerted by colleagues to the unfolding drama. Cameras flashed despite the court's rules against photography. Judge Harrington's face contorted with rage and fear. "You've ruined everything," he hissed at Alina, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," Alina replied calmly. "I've waited 40 years to do it." 2 hours later, Alina sat in District Attorney Collins' office, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Darius waited outside, still processing everything he'd learned about his family's history. Collins, a man in his 50s who had built his career on being tough but fair, looked at Alina with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "You could have brought this to me privately, Ms. Washington. Did you have to create a circus in my courtroom?" "Would you have believed me?" Alina asked simply. A black woman accusing one of the most respected judges in the state of being a Klansman in his youth. Without seeing the evidence and my reaction simultaneously, would you have given it fair consideration? Collins sighed, unable to honestly say yes. "The case against your client is being dismissed. Given the circumstances, we can't proceed with Judge Harrington presiding, and the optics of transferring it now would be problematic." And Judge Harrington. The Judicial Ethics Committee has already called an emergency meeting. He's facing suspension pending investigation, and frankly, his career is over. The governor just issued a statement condemning hate groups and promising a full review of Harrington's past cases, particularly those involving minority defendants. Alina nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions, vindication, relief, and a bone-deep weariness. It doesn't bring back what Marcus lost. The beating left him with seizures that eventually killed him 10 years ago. His wife, my best friend Sarah, never recovered from watching her husband suffer. She died believing there would never be justice. Collins looked uncomfortable. "There may be criminal charges, Ms. Washington. The statute of limitations has expired for the assault, but if we can prove Harrington perjured himself during his judicial confirmation hearings when asked about affiliations with hate groups, that's another matter." "I'm not interested in vengeance, Mr. Collins. I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted my client Marcus's grandson to receive fair treatment. And I wanted to keep my promise to Sarah that someday, somehow, I would make sure the world knew what happened to her husband." When Alina left the DA's office, Darius was waiting. "My grandmother never told me the details," he said quietly. "She just said Grandpa Marcus had been hurt by some bad men when my dad was little." "Sarah wanted to protect your father and later you from the pain," Alina explained as they walked slowly down the courthouse steps. "But she kept everything, the hospital records, Marcus's statement that the police ignored, newspaper clippings about similar attacks. She gave them to me when she got sick, made me promise to find a way to use them if the opportunity ever came." Darius shook his head in disbelief. "And you waited all this time?" Watching Judge Harrington succeed, get appointed to the bench, knowing what he'd done. "I waited for the right moment," Alina said. "For years it would have been my word against his, and we know how that would have ended. I needed him to reveal himself, to show the same pattern of bias and hatred. When I heard he would be presiding over your case, I knew the time had finally come." Outside, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions. Alina raised a hand for quiet. "I have practiced law in this courthouse for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "I have seen progress, yes, but also the persistent patterns of injustice that continue to plague our system. Today wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about breaking a cycle that has destroyed too many lives for too long." As the reporters continued shouting questions, Alina gently guided Darius away from the crowd. "Let's go see your grandmother," she said softly. "Sarah may be gone, but your mother should hear this news from us, not the evening broadcast." That evening in the modest home where Darius had grown up, Alina sat with his mother Patricia, Marcus, and Sarah's daughter-in-law. Patricia had listened in stunned silence as Alina and Darius recounted the day's events. "Dad never talked about that night," Patricia said finally, wiping tears from her eyes. "But it changed him. The seizures got worse over the years, and he carried this heaviness. Mom would get so angry sometimes, not at him, but at the injustice of it all." Alina nodded. "Sarah was my best friend since childhood. We went to segregated schools together, marched for civil rights together. When she met Marcus, this brilliant, gentle man who'd fought so hard for his education, she knew he was the one. Watching what happened to him broke something in her. Patricia reached for a photo album on the shelf, opening it to a picture of her father-in-law, a handsome man with kind eyes, standing proudly in a suit next to Sarah on their wedding day. He deserved better. Yes, he did, Alina agreed. They both did. Darius, who had been quiet, finally spoke. So what happens now to Judge Harrington, I mean? He'll face consequences, finally, Alina said. But more importantly, every case he ever presided over will be reviewed, especially those involving black defendants. Some people might get justice they were denied. That's what matters most. Later that night, as Alina drove home to her empty house, her phone rang continuously with calls from national news outlets wanting interviews. She ignored them all. This wasn't about her becoming some kind of celebrity crusader. It was about a promise kept, about honoring Marcus and Sarah's memory, about making sure their grandson had a chance at the fair treatment they'd been denied. At home, Alina carefully placed the original photograph back in the box of evidence Sarah had entrusted to her, alongside Marcus's hospital records and the police report that dismissed his assault as a drunken brawl, despite the burning cross found nearby. The next morning, Alina woke to find news vans parked outside her home. Judge Richard Harrington had resigned overnight, issuing a statement claiming the photograph had been taken out of context and that he had moved beyond the regrettable associations of his youth. He denied direct involvement in the assault on Marcus Turner, but offered no explanation for the distinctive scar. Alina declined all interview requests but issued a simple statement. Justice delayed is not justice denied. For 40 years, I have carried the truth, waiting for the day when it would be heard. That day has finally come. A week later, the county commission held an emergency meeting to address the fallout from Judge Harrington's resignation. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters demanding a review of all his past rulings. Among them were faces Alina recognized, former clients who had stood before Harrington and received sentences far harsher than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Inside, Alina sat quietly in the back row as Commission Chairman Robert Lewis, a contemporary of Harrington's who had always treated Alina with thinly veiled condescension, called the meeting to order. In light of recent events, Lewis began, clearing his throat uncomfortably, we are establishing an independent review panel to examine cases presided over by Judge Harrington where concerns of potential bias may exist. Alina listened as Lewis announced the panel members, a diverse group that included respected attorneys from across the state, as well as representatives from civil rights organizations. It was more than she had expected, a sign that perhaps the system could change when pushed hard enough. After the meeting, as Alina made her way out, she was stopped by a young black woman in a crisp suit. Ms. Washington, I'm Aisha Johnson, newly appointed to the review panel. I just wanted to say you're the reason I became a lawyer. I watched you argue a case when I was in high school, and I decided that day that's what I wanted to do. Alina smiled, genuinely touched. That's kind of you to say, Ms. Johnson. It's not kindness, it's truth, Aisha replied earnestly. What you did last week, that took incredible courage. You've changed things here, opened doors that were firmly shut before. As they parted ways, Alina felt a weight lifting. Perhaps her final case hadn't marked the end of her career, but a new beginning for justice in a community that had denied it for too long. At home that evening, Alina received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Wheeler, the man who had assaulted Darius, stood awkwardly on her porch, hands shoved in his pockets. Ms. Washington, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. I wanted to apologize. Alina regarded him cautiously. To me, I think your apology belongs to Darius Turner. Wheeler nodded. I'm going to talk to him too, but the things that came out about my Uncle Stanley, about Judge Harrington, I didn't know. My family never talked about those days. Willful ignorance is still a choice, Mr. Wheeler, Alina said firmly. The past doesn't stay buried unless we actively help shovel the dirt. Wheeler winced at her directness. You're right. I've been hearing stories since this all came out, things my uncle did, people he hurt. And I realized I've been carrying on something ugly without even knowing its origin. I just want to break the cycle. Alina studied him for a long moment. Breaking cycles takes more than words, Mr. Wheeler. It takes action sustained over time. Are you prepared for that? I want to try, he said simply. That's why I'm here. Alina nodded. Then start by making things right with Darius, and then look hard at where your prejudices came from and do the work to dismantle them. That's not my job to guide you through, it's yours. After Wheeler left, Alina sat on her porch swing, watching the sunset. Her phone rang Darius, calling to tell her that Wheeler had reached out to apologize. They had agreed to meet to talk, to begin the difficult process of understanding and reconciliation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. One exposed judge and one apology couldn't erase generations of injustice. But it was a start, a crack in the foundation of a system built on silence and complicity. The following Sunday, Alina visited Sarah and Marcus's graves, placing fresh flowers between their headstones as she had done every month since they passed. "I kept my promise, old friends," she said softly. "It took longer than any of us expected, but the truth finally had its day in court." As she stood to leave, Alina noticed an elderly white man watching her from a respectful distance. After a moment, she recognized him, James Bentley, the court reporter who had been present during countless trials over her 40-year career. "Mr. Bentley," she acknowledged with a nod. He approached slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. "Ms. Washington, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, just visiting old friends." Bentley looked at the headstones, then back at Alina. "I knew Marcus Turner, you know." "Not well, but I remember when he was brought into the emergency room that night in '67. I was there with my wife, she was a nurse." Alina's breath caught. "You were there?" "Yes," he said, his voice heavy with old regret. "I recognized some of the men who did it, not just Harrington, but others, prominent men in the community. I wanted to say something, but—" "But you didn't," Alina finished for him. "No, I didn't," Bentley admitted. "I was afraid for my job, for my family." "It's no excuse, but it's the truth. When you showed that photograph in court last week, it all came flooding back. The shame of staying silent for so long." Alina considered the man before her another keeper of the truth who had chosen silence. "Why are you telling me this now, Mr. Bentley?" "Because I'm dying, Ms. Washington, cancer, and I can't take this knowledge with me. I kept records, names, dates, incidents I witnessed or heard about. Things said in chambers when no one thought the court reporter was paying attention." He held out a thick manila envelope. "It's all here. Maybe it's too late to matter, but—" "It's never too late for the truth, Mr. Bentley," Alina said, taking the envelope. "Thank you for your courage, even if it came at the 11th hour." 2 months later, the review panel released its preliminary findings. Over 300 cases presided over by Judge Harrington showed significant evidence of racial bias in sentencing. Dozens of convictions were recommended for immediate review, with several outright reversals already in process. Alina, who had reluctantly agreed to serve as a consultant to the panel, found herself working alongside Aisha Johnson and a team of dedicated young attorneys sifting through decades of injustice. The work was exhausting but necessary. Each file represented a life affected by Harrington's prejudice, each reversal a small measure of restoration. The information Bentley had provided proved invaluable, revealing a network of influential men who had protected each other while perpetuating systems of inequality. Some were long dead, but others still held positions of power in the community. As the evidence mounted, more resignations followed, more investigations opened. On the 1-year anniversary of her confrontation with Judge Harrington, Alina stood again in the courtroom where it had all happened. This time, she was being honored by the State Bar Association for her lifetime commitment to justice and extraordinary courage in the face of systemic corruption. Darius sat in the front row, alongside his mother Patricia, and surprisingly, Thomas Wheeler, whose genuine efforts at change had slowly earned him a place in the ongoing conversation about healing and reconciliation in the community. As Alina accepted the plaque, she looked out at the faces before her old colleagues and young admirers, the powerful and the formerly powerless, all gathered to acknowledge a shift in the foundation of their shared community. 40 years ago, she began, I made a promise to my dearest friends that the truth would someday have its day in court. I could not have imagined then how long that day would take to arrive, or what it would cost all of us in the waiting. She paused, looking at the plaque in her hands. This recognition belongs not to me but to Marcus and Sarah Turner, who suffered the injustice that I merely exposed. It belongs to every client who stood before a biased judge and knew in their heart that the scales were tipped against them from the start. It belongs to those who spoke up and those who couldn't, those who fought and those who endured. Alina set the plaque aside and instead held up a different item, the photograph that had changed everything. The truth was always here, waiting to be acknowledged. The question for all of us now is, what other truths are we choosing not to see? What injustices continue because we find it easier to look away? She smiled then, a smile that held both wisdom and challenge. I may have retired from practicing law, but I will never retire from the pursuit of justice. I hope none of us will. As applause filled the courtroom, Alina felt a sense of completion. The cycle hadn't been broken entirely, such deep-rooted problems never disappeared overnight, but it had been disrupted, exposed to the light where healing could begin. Outside the courthouse, a group of law students waited to speak with her. Among them was Darius Turner, who had been inspired by Alina's example to pursue a legal career of his own. "Ms. Washington," one young woman asked, "after everything you've seen, do you believe the system can truly change?" Alina considered the question carefully. "Systems don't change on their own," she said finally. "They change because people within them demand better, because truth-tellers refuse to be silent, because new generations look at old problems with fresh eyes and the courage to solve them." She looked at Darius, standing tall and purposeful among his peers. "I believe in the possibility of justice, even when it's long delayed. And I believe in the power of memory, not as a burden to carry, but as a torch to light the way forward." As the students gathered around her, eager for more wisdom, Alina felt the presence of Marcus and Sarah, not as ghosts from a painful past, but as witnesses to a future they had helped create through their suffering and resilience. The journey toward justice continued, carried forward by new hands, new voices, but guided by the same unwavering commitment to truth that had sustained Alina through 40 years of waiting for the right moment to speak. In that moment, standing in the shadow of the courthouse where she had fought so many battles, Alina Washington knew that her most important case had never really been about exposing one man's dark past. It had been about illuminating a path forward for Darius, for the community, and for all those who would continue the work of bending the long arc of history toward justice. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.